I sat in a cold, mahogany-filled office in downtown Knoxville 3 days ago, listening to the rhythmic, annoying tick of a grandfather clock that seemed to be mocking me. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old paper, floor wax, and that burnt coffee smell you only find in places where people spend their lives arguing over fine print. Mr. Brennan, a lawyer who looked like he'd been carved out of a very expensive piece of granite, sat across from me, adjusting his spectacles with a level of gravity that usually suggests someone has died or is about to lose their house. He pushed a single sheet of paper toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was handling a live grenade. He expected me to be devastated, or maybe he expected me to beg for a compromise, but as my eyes scanned those lines of cold legal jargon, something strange happened. I felt a laugh starting in my toes, bubbling up through my chest until it burst out of me. Loud, jagged, and filling that stuffy office until the lawyer actually pulled back in his chair. He asked if I needed a glass of water, probably wondering if the unstable daughter my parents had described had finally shown up, but I just couldn't stop. The paper was a quitclaim deed. My parents hadn't spoken to me in 2 years. Not a single happy birthday. Not a text to see if I survived the flu. Not even a forwarded chain email about a sale at the grocery store. I had been ghosted by the people who brought me into this world because I finally stopped being the family's favorite doormat. And yet, after 700 days of silence, they didn't reach out to say they missed me. They reached out through a man in a three-piece suit to ask for my signature. They wanted to sell my grandfather Howard's lake house, the only place on this earth that ever felt like home, to bail out my sister Meredith from yet another one of her expensive disasters. They thought this document was their final move to take everything I had left, but they didn't realize that Grandpa Howard had spent his final years making sure I was the one holding all the cards. Before I tell you about the secret Grandpa hid in a cedar tackle box, I want to say how much I appreciate you being here. If you've ever been the black sheep of the family or felt like you were only loved when you were useful, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me tell these stories to women who have been through the same thing. I also love knowing who I'm talking to, so please drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It makes this big world feel a little smaller when we can all connect. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. To the town outside Knoxville where my father's reputation was worth more than his own daughter's happiness. My name is Paige Afton. I'm 32 years old, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that being the strong one is just a polite way of saying you're the one who gets ignored. My father, Gerald Afton, was the manager of the local First Heritage Bank branch. He was a man who believed a firm handshake, a crisp white shirt, and a reserved pew at the Sunday service were the keys to salvation. He was a pillar of the community, the kind of man who always knew the right thing to say to a stranger, but didn't have a clue what was going on in his own hallway. My mother, Diane, ran the women's Bible study and organized the annual harvest potluck with the precision of a military invasion. Together, they were the picture-perfect couple you'd see in a frame at Hobby Lobby. But inside our house, things were balanced like a ledger that was always missing the most important lines. I grew up in a house where everything had its place, but I always felt like I was the extra piece left over after the furniture was assembled. Then there was Meredith, my little sister. She was 3 years younger and somehow lived her life 3,000 times more importantly than I did in my parents' eyes. Meredith was the one who got piano lessons because she was gifted, while I was told that maybe we'd have the budget for my art classes next year. A year that never seemed to arrive on the calendar. She was the one who got a used but shiny Honda Civic for her 16th birthday, tied with a big red bow that probably cost more than my first bike. I was handed a bus pass and a helpful suggestion to start asking around at the local diner for part-time work if I wanted gas money. Meredith had the big bedroom with the bay window overlooking the garden because she supposedly needed space to practice her creative side, while I was tucked away in a tiny room that shared a wall with the laundry room. I spent my entire teenage life learning to fall asleep to the aggressive thumping and humming of the spin cycle. My father used to joke that the vibration was probably good for my character. Looking back, it was just the soundtrack to my life. Sitting quietly while the rest of the house hummed along for someone else's benefit. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm 32, I'm an accountant, and I've got a good head on my shoulders. I'm telling you this because it explains the strong one syndrome. Whenever I would try to ask why Meredith got the new clothes while I got the hand-me-downs from a cousin I didn't even like, my father would set down his fork, give me that calm, professional look he used for denying loan applications, and tell me that Meredith simply needed more help. He'd look me in the eye and say I was the strong one, that he admired my independence, and that he knew I could handle things on my own. He wore my resilience like a badge of honor for himself, never realizing that he was the one forcing me to build those walls in the first place. To him, strong didn't mean admirable. It meant low maintenance. It meant she won't complain. It meant I don't have to worry about her, so I can go back to fixing Meredith's latest mess. By the time I was 18, I'd worn that strong label until it felt like a lead weight around my neck. I worked double shifts at the diner all through high school, saving every nickel to buy my own prom dress and pay for my own textbooks. I was the first person in my family to actually graduate from college, earning a bachelor's in accounting from the state university. I did it while working 25 hours a week at a tax prep office and waking up to a 5:15 a.m. alarm every single day for 4 years. No help, no cosigner on my student loans, and no congratulations dinner that didn't somehow turn into a discussion about Meredith's newest apartment deposit. My parents promised they'd be at my graduation. My mother even picked out a new floral dress for the occasion, and my father spent weeks asking about the parking situation and what time the gates opened. I reserved 4 seats, one for them, one for Meredith, and one for Grandpa Howard, who was the only person who never made me feel like an afterthought. But on the morning of the ceremony, the phone rang at 7 o'clock. It was my father, his voice sounding like he was reading a weather report, explaining that something had come up. Apparently, Meredith was moving into a new apartment that weekend, and she'd realized she couldn't move the heavy sofa by herself. She was stressed, she was crying, and they just couldn't leave her in that state. I could hear my mother in the background asking about a tape gun, her voice light and casual, as if my 4 years of struggle were just a minor scheduling conflict. They told me it was just a ceremony and that I already had the degree anyway. So what was the big deal? I walked across that stage in front of a sea of cheering families, sat in a row of people I didn't know, and took my own graduation photo by propping my phone against a park bench and setting the timer. The only person who called to tell me he was proud of me was Grandpa Howard. His voice was rough, like he was trying not to let me hear him cry. He whispered that he was sorry the rest of the family had scales on their eyes, and then he said something I'd never forget. "Don't you worry, Paige. I already took care of it." At 22, I thought he was talking about a graduation card with a check inside. I had no idea that Grandpa was actually building a fortress for me, one that would take 7 years to finally reveal its secrets. It wasn't until I sat in that lawyer's office, staring at a demand for my signature, that I realized just how much Grandpa Howard had seen through my father's crisp white shirts. I started my career as a junior accountant at a firm downtown, a place where the carpets were a dull shade of gray, and the only excitement was when the vending machine accidentally gave you 2 bags of pretzels instead of 1. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I had my own cubicle, my own nameplate, and a paycheck that I didn't have to explain to anyone. But even though I was living in a small apartment 45 minutes away, the strong one label followed me like a shadow. My mother would call me on Tuesday nights, not to ask how my week was going, but to tell me that Meredith had accidentally overdrawn her checking account again and was too embarrassed to tell our father. She'd hint that since I was so good with numbers and so stable, maybe I could just send a little something to tide her over. It was always a loan, and I was always the responsible daughter for helping. It's funny how in my family, being responsible was just another way of saying I was the designated safety net for everyone else's falls. That's when I met Daniel Reeves. He was rewiring the office building after a storm had fried half the circuits in the server room. I heard him before I saw him. He was singing a Johnny Cash song, completely off-key but with so much heart that I couldn't help but smile. He was standing on a ladder, his arms covered in dust, wearing a work shirt that had Reeves Electric stitched over the pocket. When he looked down and saw me watching him, he didn't give me a professional nod or a banker's handshake. He just grinned, wiped his hand on his jeans, and asked if I knew where a guy could get a decent cup of coffee that didn't taste like battery acid. Daniel was an electrician, A man who worked 14-hour days and came home with grease under his fingernails and a back that ached from crawling through crawl spaces. He ran his own one-man operation out of a second-hand van that he treated like a member of the family. He was the most honest person I'd ever met. On our third date, he showed up at my door with a bunch of wilted wildflowers he'd bought at a gas station. He looked so genuinely upset as he explained that the florist had closed 5 minutes before he got there, and he didn't want to show up at my house empty-handed. I didn't care about the flowers. I cared that for the first time in my life, someone felt I was worth the effort of trying, even if they failed. When I finally introduced him to my parents, I thought, naively, that they would be happy for me. I thought they would see a hard-working, self-made man who treated their daughter like she was the center of the universe. We had dinner at my parents' house, a meal that felt more like a cross-examination than a celebration. My father sat at the head of the table, his shirt perfectly pressed, looking at Daniel's calloused hands like they were a foreign language he refused to learn. Daniel was polite, he was funny, and he even offered to look at a flickering light in their hallway for free. But my father just looked through him. Later that evening, after Daniel had gone to the truck to grab his jacket, my father leaned over his roast chicken and said, with that terrifyingly calm voice of his, that he thought I would have aimed higher. He told me that marrying an electrician was a downgrade for an Afton. My mother didn't defend me. She just pressed her lips together and adjusted the lace runner on the table, while Meredith made a little face at her phone, probably texting her friends about how blue-collar my new boyfriend was. They didn't see Daniel's heart. They just saw his tax bracket. They saw a man who didn't fit into their Hobby Lobby frame. Before things got even worse, and believe me, they did, I want to take a quick second to say thank you so much for listening. It really means a lot to me that you're spending your time with Paige's story. If this is touching your heart or reminding you of someone you know, please give this video a like and leave a comment. It's a small thing, but it helps me keep this channel going, and I truly appreciate every single one of you. Now, back to that dinner that changed everything. That downgrade comment stayed with me for years. We got married when I was 28, a small ceremony on the courthouse steps. I didn't want a big church wedding because Grandpa Howard had passed away 3 years earlier, and the thought of walking down an aisle without him felt like a hole in my chest. I wasn't ready to show the world. My parents came, but they looked like they were attending a funeral. They stood in the back, checking their watches, and left before the cake was even cut, because Meredith had a migraine and needed to be driven home. For the next few years, Daniel and I built a life. He worked his fingers to the bone, growing his business from 1 van to 3, and I moved up to senior accountant. We bought a little house with a porch and a backyard that caught the morning light. We were happy, but the silence from my parents' house was a heavy thing. They only called when they needed something. When Meredith decided she wanted to be an interior designer and spent $5,000 on business cards and silk samples before realizing she didn't know how to use a tape measure, my father called me. He didn't ask about Daniel's business or our new house. He asked if I could consult on Meredith's finances, which was just code for, "Can you pay her credit card bill so I don't have to tell your mother we're over budget?" I did it. I kept doing it. I kept being the strong one, the stable one, the one who didn't need a pat on the back because I was already standing on my own 2 feet. I let them treat Daniel like he was the help whenever we visited for Christmas. I let them ignore my achievements while they threw a party for Meredith because she finally managed to keep a job for 6 months. I thought that if I just kept showing up, if I just kept being the daughter they could depend on, one day they would look at me and say, "We're proud of you, Paige." But the thing about being the strong one is that people eventually stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a resource. And resources don't have feelings. They just have results. My father didn't see a daughter who was hurting. He saw an accountant who was doing well for herself, and therefore didn't need his love. My mother didn't see a woman who missed her grandfather. She saw a daughter who was too busy with her husband to help with the church bake sale. We were becoming strangers who shared a last name and a few awkward holidays. And as that Christmas dinner approached, the one that would eventually lead to that lawyer's office, I had no idea that the downgrade my father talked about was actually his own soul. I'd catch myself sometimes, looking at the old photos of Grandpa Howard and me at the lake house. He used to tell me that the lake didn't care who you were or what you did for a living. It only cared if you were honest with the water. My father had forgotten how to be honest a long time ago. He was too busy managing the Afton brand. He didn't realize that while he was busy looking down on Daniel and me, he was losing the only person who would have stayed by his side when the money finally ran out. But that's the thing about pride. It feels like a shield until it turns into a cage. And my father was building his cage one downgrade comment at a time. Christmas at the Afton house was never really about the holiday. It was a high-stakes theatrical production where my mother was the director and my father was the lead critic. Imagine 15 people crammed into a living room that was already overflowing with enough garland and twinkling lights to be seen from space. The air was a thick mix of pine-scented spray, roasting ham, and a layer of tension so heavy you could almost reach out and grab it. Everyone was there. Aunt Linda, who always brought a casserole no one ate. Uncle Ray, who spent the whole afternoon trying to find a corner where he could nap. And my cousin Rachel, who was busy chasing a toddler around the coffee table. It was the kind of scene that looks beautiful in a photograph, but feels like a pressure cooker when you're standing in the middle of it. I was 30 years old, and for the first time, I felt like a guest in my own childhood home. Daniel was by my side, looking like a giant in a dollhouse as he balanced a plate of food on his knees. My father spent the afternoon holding court, explaining the realities of the banking world to anyone who couldn't escape his line of sight. He walked right past Daniel multiple times without a word, acting as if my husband was just a particularly sturdy piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. I watched Daniel keep his cool, offering a polite nod whenever my father made eye contact, but I could see the muscles in his jaw working. He was staying for me, and I knew it. The Afton performance hit its peak right as the pie was being served. Meredith pulled me into the kitchen, her eyes already doing that damp, shimmering thing that usually preceded a request for money. She told me she needed $5,000. She didn't ask. She informed me, calling it a bridge loan for a boutique she was opening. A shop that would sell overpriced candles and linen robes that nobody in our town actually needed. I stood there looking at my sister, and for the first time in my life, the Strong One badge felt too heavy to wear. I told her no. I said it clearly, remind her that she still hadn't paid back the last 2 loans I'd given her. I wasn't mean about it. I was just honest. I told her I had a mortgage and a business of my own to think about. Meredith didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She just did something far more effective. She walked back into the living room with a trembling lip and sat down next to our father. The room went silent instantly. It was like someone had pulled the plug on the holiday. My father didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He stood up from his recliner like he'd been launched by a spring and looked directly at me. In front of the entire family, Aunt Linda with her fork halfway to her mouth, the cousins, the neighbors. He demanded to know what kind of sister would refuse to help her own blood. He called me selfish. He said I had changed and that the old Paige would have never turned her back on her family. But the real blow didn't come from him. It came from my mother. She was standing by the punch bowl and she leaned toward my Aunt Carol, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the room. She said she was deeply worried about me. She told the entire room that I'd been unstable ever since I married Daniel, and she honestly believed I needed to see a professional. She used the language of care to commit a public execution of my character. She made it sound like my refusal to give Meredith money was a symptom of a mental breakdown. I stood in the center of that room, surrounded by 15 people I had known since birth, and I realized I was completely alone. Not one person spoke up. Not one person said, "Hey, that's not fair." They all just looked at their plates, suddenly very interested in their pecan pie. Before I tell you about the silence that followed and the 2 years of lies that were about to begin, I want to take a quick second to speak from the heart. If you're enjoying this story, it would mean so much to me if you could subscribe and leave a like. It's a small gesture for you, but it truly helps me keep this channel going and share these stories with women who need to know they aren't alone. Thank you for being such a wonderful part of this community. Now, let's get back to that cold December night. I felt something shift inside me in that moment. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. I realized that as long as I stayed in that room, I would always be the strong one they could use or the defective one they could blame. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a utility. Daniel didn't wait for me to say a word. He was already standing by the door, my coat over his arm, his expression as steady as a rock. He didn't yell back at my father, and he didn't argue with my mother. He just waited for me to decide. I walked over to my cousin Rachel, kissed her baby on the forehead, and walked out of that house. I didn't look back at my father's red face or my mother's concerned expression. I just walked. The drive home was 45 minutes of absolute silence. It wasn't the awkward kind of silence you have after an argument. It was the kind that feels like a clean slate. I looked out the window at the dark Tennessee hills and realized that for the first time in 32 years, I didn't have anyone to please. But as we pulled into our driveway, I didn't know that the real war was just starting. I didn't know that my mother was already on the phone with the rest of the family, telling them a version of the night that made me look like a villain in a melodrama. Within weeks, the narrative was set in stone. My parents told everyone in town that I had snapped at Christmas. They told our relatives that Daniel was controlling me and isolating me from the people who loved me. My father even called my former boss to check in on my well-being, effectively poisoning my reputation in the small professional circle of our town. It was a calculated, quiet destruction. They didn't use fire, they used whispers. And one by one, the phone calls from aunts and cousins stopped. The birthday texts vanished. I was on the outside, looking in at a family that had decided I was no longer part of the ledger. It was during those first few months of silence that I found myself sitting on my porch, wondering if I had really made a mistake. I'd catch myself looking at my phone, hoping for a text that said, "We're sorry. Come home." But it never came. Instead, I'd hear from Rachel that my mother was telling people I was in therapy for my episodes. It was a lie built out of thin air, served to people who trusted her. I felt like I was being erased. But every time I started to doubt myself, I'd look at Daniel, or I'd think about Grandpa Howard. I started to realize that the silence wasn't a punishment. It was a gift. It was the only way I could finally hear my own voice over the noise of their expectations. I was healing, even if it felt like breaking. And as the spring air started to turn warm, I didn't know that a lawyer named Mr. Brennan was already preparing an envelope that would bring me right back to the center of the storm. For 2 years, silence became my new normal, and I discovered that it didn't sound as empty as I thought it would. It actually sounded like Daniel humming while he fixed the toaster, or the wind moving through the oak trees in our backyard, or the quiet scratch of my pen as I balanced the books for our growing business. We had moved about 45 minutes away, just far enough to avoid seeing my father's judgmental stare at the local grocery store, but close enough to feel the weight of the town's whispers. I was healing, but it was a slow, uneven process, like trying to walk on a leg that had been asleep for too long. Every time I thought I was over the betrayal, I'd hear a story from Rachel about how my mother was still playing the martyr at her Bible study, sighing about her poor, troubled daughter while passing around the lemon bars. It's funny how the people who break you are always the ones who tell the world they're the ones trying to put you back together. My father had convinced half the county that I was a danger to myself and that Daniel was some kind of villain keeping me locked away. In a small town, a banker's word is gospel, and an accountant's silence is usually taken as a confession. I spent many nights sitting on our porch, wondering if I should fight back. But Daniel would always just take my hand and tell me that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. He told me that eventually, the people who actually mattered would see through the smoke. I wanted to believe him, but some days, the smoke felt thick enough to choke me. Then came that Tuesday in March. I remember it clearly because I had just finished complaining about how my knees were starting to make a clicking sound every time I stood up. A lovely little gift from my 32nd birthday. I walked out to the mailbox, expecting nothing more than a utility bill or a flyer for a lawn care service I didn't need. Instead, I found a thick white envelope with a professional return address from a law firm I didn't recognize. My stomach did a slow, icy roll. When you've been cut off from your family and branded as unstable, a letter from a lawyer feels like a threat before you even open it. I let that envelope sit on my kitchen counter for 2 whole days. I looked at it while I made coffee. I stared at it while I washed the dishes. I was terrified that it was some kind of legal move to take away my peace. Or maybe my parents were finally trying to sue for some imagined grievance. When I finally worked up the courage to open it on a Thursday morning, the house was quiet, and the sun was hitting the kitchen table in a way that made everything look peaceful. A sharp contrast to the storm that was about to break. The letter was from a Mr. Brennan. It stated, in very dry and very expensive language, that my father was initiating the sale of the property at 14 Cedar Mill Road, Grandpa Howard's lake house. Because I was a potential heir, they needed me to sign a quitclaim deed, essentially waiving any right I might ever have to the place. They had a buyer ready for $320,000, and they needed my signature within 30 days. No phone call. No, how are you? No, we're sorry for what we said at Christmas. Just a cold demand for my signature so they could turn my grandfather's legacy into a check for Meredith's failing boutique. I sat there staring at that paper, and for the first time in years, I felt Grandpa Howard's presence in the room. I looked up at the small wooden shelf Daniel had built above the stove. On it sat Grandpa's old fishing tackle box. It was made of cedar, with brass hinges that had turned dark with age, and his initials, HRA, were carved into the lid. It still smelled like lake water, linseed oil, and a life lived with honest hands. Inside that box, tucked right against the bottom, was an envelope I had found while clearing out his things after the funeral 7 years ago. It was yellowed, taped shut with heavy-duty packing tape, and had 4 words written on the front in his slanted, shaky handwriting. For Paige when you need it. I had never opened it. I think I was afraid that if I read his final words, he'd truly be gone. I'd spent 7 years keeping that letter as a safety net, a little piece of him I could still hold on to. But as I looked from the lawyer's cold demand to that weathered cedar box, I knew the time had come. My hands were shaking as I pulled the box down. I had to use a kitchen knife to carefully slice through the old tape. Inside were 2 things that changed the entire trajectory of my life. The first was a legal document, heavy and stamped with a gold seal, an irrevocable trust deed. I'm an accountant. I know how to read the fine print. I saw the dates and I saw the names. Grandpa Howard hadn't left the lake house to his estate to be settled by his son. 7 years ago, 3 years before he even passed away, he had moved the entire property into a private trust. He had named his personal attorney, a man named Mr. Calloway, as the trustee. And there, on page 3, under the word beneficiary, was my name, Paige Ellen Afton. Not my father's name, not Meredith's, just mine. The second thing in the box was a single sheet of notebook paper, folded twice. Grandpa's handwriting was deliberate, the way a man writes when he's trying to be very careful with his words. He told me that he knew my father. He said that Gerald meant well, but that he didn't see straight when it came to my sister. He told me that the house was mine, that it had always been mine, and that I should never let anyone tell me otherwise. He told me to be the strong one, but this time he meant the kind of strong that stands up for the truth, not the kind that sits quietly and takes the hits. I sat on my kitchen floor and cried until my ribs ached. It wasn't the kind of crying you do when you're heartbroken. It was the kind you do when you realize you've been seen. All those years I thought I was invisible. All those graduations I spent alone. All those dinners where I was a downgrade. Grandpa Howard had been watching. He had seen the way they treated me, and he had reached out from the past to put a shield in my hand. He didn't just feel sorry for me. He did something about it. He knew that one day my father would come for that house. He knew they would try to use it to bail out Meredith's mistakes, and he had ensured that the house would be the very thing that finally stripped the mask off my father's perfect reputation. As I sat there with the trust deed in my lap, I realized I wasn't just holding a piece of property. I was holding the power to finally end the story my parents had been writing for me. Before I tell you what I did next and how I prepared for the meeting that would blow the Afton family ledger wide open, I have to ask, have you ever had a moment where you found out someone was in your corner the whole time without you knowing it? Maybe a grandmother, an old teacher, or a friend who saw your value when you couldn't? It's a powerful feeling, isn't it? If you're enjoying the way this story is turning around, please hit that like button. It helps get this story out to more women who might need a reminder that they are worth protecting too. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time, because the next block is where the real fireworks start. That evening, when Daniel came home, he found me still sitting at the table with the documents spread out like a battle plan. He didn't say a word at first. He just looked at the trust deed, then at Grandpa's letter, and then at me. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and listened as I explained that the house my father was trying to sell for $300,000 didn't even belong to him. Daniel's eyes crinkled in that way they do when he's proud of me, and he told me that I didn't have to be the strong one anymore. I just had to be the one who told the truth. I spent the next few days preparing like I was headed into a high-stakes audit. I called Mr. Calloway, the trustee Grandpa had named. He had been waiting for my call for 7 years. He told me the trust was valid, unchallenged, and that my father's name appeared nowhere in the chain of title. He offered to come to the meeting, but I told him I wanted to handle this one myself. I wanted to see my father's face when he realized that he couldn't allocate me out of my own inheritance. I was no longer the girl who shared a wall with the laundry room. I was the beneficiary of a man who loved me enough to plan for my victory long after he was gone. And I was finally ready to sign a document, just not the one my father was expecting. The week leading up to the meeting felt like I was preparing for the most important audit of my life. As an accountant, I know that numbers don't have feelings and they don't tell lies. They just sit there waiting for someone to add them up. I spent my evenings at the kitchen table with a highlighter and a stack of certified copies from Mr. Calloway, the trustee. I wasn't just looking at legal descriptions of property. I was looking at the physical proof that I existed in my grandfather's heart. Every time I touched the heavy, embossed paper of the trust deed, I felt a little less like the unstable daughter my parents had invented and a little more like the woman Grandpa Howard knew I could be. Daniel stayed out of my way, mostly just keeping the coffee pot full and squeezing my shoulder whenever he walked by, which was exactly the kind of support I needed. He knew this wasn't just about a house. It was about the truth finally catching up to a man who had spent 30 years running away from it. On Thursday night, the day before I was supposed to face my father, I got a phone call from my cousin Rachel. Her voice was low and hushed, like she was afraid the walls in our small town had ears, which, let's be honest, they usually do. She told me she had some information I needed to hear before I walked into that lawyer's office. It turned out that my father's bridge loan for Meredith's boutique wasn't just a small family favor. The boutique was a disaster zone. Meredith had spent money on imported Italian velvet hangers and custom-scented shopping bags before she'd even sold a single blouse. She was currently 18 months behind on her business plan, and the debt had ballooned to nearly $180,000. But that wasn't the worst part. Rachel told me that my father, the respected bank manager who lectured everyone on fiscal responsibility, had refinanced the mortgage on their family home on Birchwood to keep the boutique afloat. He had gambled his own retirement and the roof over my mother's head on Meredith's dream of selling $50 organic cotton socks. The bank was calling in his personal guarantee, and he was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. He needed that $320,000 from the lake house sale not just to help Meredith, but to stop the bank from foreclosing on his own house. He had told the entire family I would sign the papers because I had no use for the house, making me out to be the selfish one while he was secretly drowning in the consequences of his own favoritism. Before I tell you about the drive back to that town and the moment I walked into that conference room, I want to take a moment to say something from the bottom of my heart. Your support means everything to me. Knowing that there are people out there who understand what it's like to fight for your worth keeps me going. If this story is resonating with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It's a small thing that makes a huge difference for me. And if you've ever seen someone's pride lead them straight into a hole they dug themselves, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and I love our little community here. Now, let's get back to the Friday morning that changed everything. I drove the 45 minutes back to my hometown on Friday morning, and it felt like a trip through a ghost story. Every landmark I passed triggered a memory of being the strong one who didn't need anything. I drove past the Shell station where Grandpa Howard used to buy me chocolate milkshakes every Friday afternoon, and past the middle school where I won the spelling bee while my parents were at Meredith's dance recital. The town hadn't changed at all. Same brick storefronts, same church steeple, same feeling of being watched by people who already thought they knew my business. I felt like a stranger in the place I grew up, but for the first time, I didn't feel the need to hide. I had the cedar tackle box on the passenger seat and a folder full of truth in my bag. When I pulled up to Mr. Brennan's office on Main Street, my heart was steady. I wasn't there to scream or cry or demand an apology I knew would never come. I was there to perform a final audit of the Afton family legacy. The stairwell of the building smelled like old carpet and stale coffee, a scent that will always remind me of people trying to hide the truth behind expensive desks. The receptionist gave me a look of practiced sympathy, the kind people give you when they've already heard you're the difficult one. I sat in a squeaky vinyl chair next to a dying fern and waited. I wasn't the girl who shared a wall with the laundry room anymore. I was a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. And I knew that in about 10 minutes, my father was going to find out that his house of cards didn't have a foundation. The clock on the wall ticked past 10, and the door to the inner office finally opened. Mr. Brennan stepped out, looking polished and professional, and invited me in. I walked into that conference room and saw my father sitting at the end of a long mahogany table, his hands folded, looking like he was about to grant me a great favor. He looked exactly the same. Pressed shirt, firm jaw, and that air of quiet authority that he used to keep everyone in their place. He didn't stand up. He just offered a small, sad smile that was meant to show he was the bigger person for even being in the same room as me. I sat down across from him, set my folder on the table, and realized that for all his talk of downgrades, he was the one who was about to lose everything. The tension in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, and I could tell he was just waiting for me to pick up the pen. But I wasn't there to sign. I was there to show him that Grandpa Howard had finally balanced the books. The conference room felt smaller than it actually was, as if the walls were leaning in to hear the final chapter of a story they'd been recording for decades. My father sat at the far end of the table, his hands folded with the kind of practiced stillness that usually commands respect in a boardroom. He looked at me with a gaze that was meant to be paternal and concerned, but I could see the desperate math running behind his eyes. He started by telling the lawyer, Mr. Brennan, that he was so glad I'd finally decided to be reasonable, as if my 2 years of silence had been some kind of temper tantrum rather than a survival tactic. He talked about the lake house like it was a burden he was kindly lifting from my shoulders, mentioning how Grandpa Howard would have wanted the family to stay together, and how this sale was the only way to honor his memory. It was a masterful performance, the kind he'd probably given 1,000 times at the bank when he was convincing someone to sign a loan they couldn't afford. He even had the audacity to sigh and look at the floor, mentioning how difficult it had been for my mother and him to watch me struggle with my instability while Daniel kept me hidden away. He was painting a picture for the lawyer, establishing me as the fragile daughter who needed his firm, banking hand to guide her. I sat there, watching his mouth move, and I didn't feel the old familiar urge to defend myself or apologize for existing. I just felt a cold, quiet curiosity, like an accountant watching a client try to hide a massive deficit with a fancy font. Just as he was reaching the peak of his "we're doing this for Meredith" speech, his phone buzzed on the mahogany table. In any other meeting, he would have ignored it, but he was so confident he had me cornered that he tapped the speaker button. Meredith's voice filled the room, sharp, thin, and buzzing with a frantic kind of greed. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't even say hello. She just wanted to know if the problem was solved and if I'd signed the papers yet. She told him to remind me that it was for the family, because, in her own words, I always caved when he used that line. The silence that followed her voice hung in the air like a heavy fog. My father's neck turned a shade of red that matched the lawyer's expensive tie, and he fumbled to turn the phone off. But the mask hadn't just slipped. It had shattered into a million pieces on the floor. Before I tell you about the moment I opened my folder and changed my family's history forever, I want to invite you to be a part of our community. If you've ever had a Meredith in your life, someone who thinks your kindness is a weakness they can exploit, please hit that like button and subscribe. It lets me know that you're standing with Paige, and it helps other women find this story when they're feeling like they're the only ones fighting these battles. Also, drop a yes in the comments if you've ever had a moment where the truth finally came out when someone thought they were being clever. Now, back to the conference room, where the banker was about to find out his account was empty. I didn't say a word about the phone call. I didn't need to. I just reached into my bag and pulled out the manila folder that contained the trust deed Grandpa Howard had hidden in his tackle box. I slid a certified copy across the table toward Mr. Brennan, not even looking at my father. I watched the lawyer's eyes scan the header, irrevocable trust deed, and I saw the moment his professional posture evaporated. He looked at the date, which was 7 years old, and then he looked at the beneficiary name, Paige Ellen Afton. My father tried to interrupt, telling the lawyer that whatever I was showing him was probably just some old sentimental letter. But Brennan held up a hand and told him to be quiet in a voice that was suddenly very different from the one he'd been using all morning. The lawyer explained to my father, with the kind of brutal clarity only a legal professional can manage, that the lake house hadn't been part of Grandpa Howard's estate for nearly a decade. He told him that because the property was in an irrevocable trust, my father had never inherited it, never owned it, and certainly had no legal right to sell it to anyone. My father's face went from red to a ghostly, sickly shade of drywall white. He started stammering about probate and how he was the next of kin, but the lawyer just kept pointing at the county filing stamp on the document I'd provided. He told my father that if he had represented to a buyer that he held a clear title to that property, he was looking at a massive legal liability that went far beyond a family squabble. I watched my father realize that the $320,000 lifeline he'd promised Meredith, and the bank that was threatening to take his own house, didn't exist. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see the powerful banker or the pillar of the community. I saw a man who had gambled everything on a lie and finally lost. He tried to switch tactics, dropping his voice into that soft, manipulative register he used to get his way, pleading with me to think about our home and my mother's future. He told me that if I didn't sign a new deed transferring the house back to him, they would lose everything. He tried to use Grandpa Howard's name again, but I stopped him. I told him that Grandpa Howard was the only person who actually protected me, and I wasn't going to let my father destroy the one thing he left me just to fund Meredith's Italian velvet hangers. The room was so quiet you could hear the distant sound of traffic on Main Street, but inside the air felt electric with the weight of the truth. Mr. Brennan gathered his papers, looking like a man who wanted to be anywhere else but in that room, and told my father that the meeting was over. He told him he would need to consult a different kind of attorney for the mess he'd made with the buyer and the bank. I stood up, tucked my folder under my arm, and looked my father in the eye. I didn't feel the triumph I thought I would. I just felt a deep, exhausted sense of relief. The strong one had finally used her strength for herself, and as I walked out of that office, I knew that the Afton family ledger would never, ever be the same again. The silence that followed the meeting at Mr. Brennan's office wasn't the peaceful kind I had hoped for. It was the heavy, buzzing silence of a storm that had only just begun to move inland. I drove home to Daniel with my hands still shaking on the steering wheel, half expecting my father to pull up alongside me on the highway and demand the folder back like a teacher confiscating a cheating student's notes. But Gerald Afton didn't follow me. He did something much more characteristic of a man who spent his life believing the rules of the world were merely suggestions for people of his stature. He didn't drive home to Birchwood to tell my mother the truth. Instead, he drove straight to the lake house on Cedar Mill Road, and he took my mother and Meredith with him. I found out that evening when my cousin Rachel called me, her voice sounding like she was reporting from a war zone. She told me that my father had called the entire extended family on his way there, telling them that the meeting was a misunderstanding and that I was trying to steal the family legacy through a legal loophole. He told everyone that the lake house was his father's house, and no piece of paper written by a man in a suit was going to change the laws of God and blood. They hadn't just gone there to visit. They had gone there to squat. They were treating my grandfather's property like a fortress, and they were inviting the world to watch them do it. The real kick in the teeth came about an hour later when Rachel sent me a screenshot of Meredith's Facebook page. My sister, who apparently had enough time between dodging creditors to master the art of the perfect filter, had posted a photo of the lake house porch. There was my mother, Diane, holding a best mom ever coffee mug and looking out at the water with a serene, manufactured smile. My father stood behind her with his arms crossed, looking like the king of a very small, very dusty castle. The caption read, family time at Grandpa's lake house. Some things are worth fighting for. I stared at that photo until my eyes burned. But what really broke my heart wasn't the fake smiles. It was where Meredith was sitting. She was lounging in the green Adirondack chair that Grandpa Howard had built himself the summer I turned 10. I remembered sanding those armrests until my palms were raw, and Grandpa letting me paint the first coat of forest green paint because he said I had a steadier hand than he did. That chair was the last place he sat before his legs got too stiff to make it down to the dock. And there was Meredith, using it as a prop for her family time theater, while her boutique was collapsing and her father was gambling their future on a lie. Before I tell you how I handled the 3 people currently drinking my grandfather's tea in my house, I want to say a huge thank you for sticking with me. This part of the story is hard to tell, but knowing you're listening makes it easier. If you've ever had a family member who thought loyalty only worked in one direction, please hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to set a boundary that felt like a war? I read every single story you share. Now, back to the 72-hour clock. I called Mr. Calloway, Grandpa's trustee, on Saturday morning. I told him I didn't want to have my father arrested for trespassing, at least not yet. Calloway, who had the patient voice of a man who had seen 80 years of human greed, told me that at some point the math has to beat the pride. He sent a formal demand letter via email and certified mail immediately. The letter was short and brutal. They were occupying property held in an irrevocable trust, their use was unauthorized, and they had exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises before a formal trespass complaint was filed with the sheriff. The clock started ticking on Monday morning, and that's when the phone calls began. My mother called me at 6:47 a.m., her voice sounding raw and jagged. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize for the Christmas execution of my character. She just told me that my father couldn't sleep, that Meredith was going to lose everything, and that I was tearing the family apart. She told me that Grandpa Howard would be ashamed of me for taking the house to punish them. I sat on the edge of my bed and told her, as calmly as I could, that I wasn't taking anything. It was already mine. I told her I had a letter from Grandpa Howard that said he wanted me protected, not used. The silence on the other end of the line was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. My mother finally told me that I had changed, and she didn't mean it as a compliment. I told her I hoped so, and then I hung up. It was the first time in 32 years that I didn't stay on the line to comfort her after she insulted me. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest, even as the 72-hour clock kept ticking down. According to Rachel, the scene at the lake house was getting desperate. My father had spent the weekend trying to find a lawyer who would tell him the trust was a fake, but every one of them told him the same thing Brennan had. The property was gone. By Monday afternoon, with 53 hours left on the clock, the pride finally broke. Mr. Brennan had called my father one last time, warned him about the legal consequences of a trespass charge on his banking record, and that was the end of the family time performance. Meredith deleted the Facebook post by Monday night. They packed up the car. My mother taking the dishes she'd brought, my father carrying out the groceries Meredith had bought like she was moving in for good. They drove away from the lake house without looking back, leaving the keys on the kitchen table along with a torn piece of paper. My father had written 4 words. This was never about the money. I didn't know if he believed it or if he just needed one last lie to tell himself so he could sleep. I didn't go to the house right away. I waited a full week, letting the air clear and the dust settle. When I finally drove out to Cedar Mill Road, the sky was a flat, surrender gray. I walked inside, and the place smelled like dust and old pine, just like it always had. The counters were wiped down, the floors were swept, and the house was quiet. I walked down to the dock and sat in Grandpa's green Adirondack chair, looking out at the water. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel like the strong one or the unstable one. I just felt like Paige. And I knew that while the house was finally empty, my life was finally starting to feel full. The numbers finally caught up with my father the way they always do. Quietly at first, and then all at once like a sudden summer thunderstorm. As an accountant, I know that you can move figures around on a spreadsheet for a long time, but eventually the page ends and the balance has to be struck. Without the $320,000 lifeline from the lake house sale, the buyer walked away, and my father's carefully constructed house of cards collapsed into a heap of overdue notices and legal threats. By June, Meredith's boutique, with its custom-scented shopping bags and Italian velvet hangers, finally closed its doors for good. She had to sell off her inventory to a liquidator at 40 cents on the dollar, a move that probably hurt her pride more than her bank account. My father's personal guarantee on her business loans came due, and the man who once looked down on Daniel's downgrade profession had to sell his beloved F-150 truck, the one he'd driven since I was in high school, just to make a dent in the debt. He had to pull from his 401k early, eating a massive penalty that pushed his dream of a 62-year-old retirement back to 67, and maybe even further. The mortgage he'd refinanced on their family home on Birchwood still hung over them like a permanent weather system that refused to move. It's funny how life works. My father spent 30 years trying to make sure his family looked perfect from the outside, only to have the truth stripped bare in a town where everyone knows everyone's business. The story didn't just stay in that lawyer's office. It traveled through the driveways and the church parking lots and the frozen food aisle at Kroger. People started asking the kind of questions Gerald couldn't deflect with a firm handshake or a mention of his bank title. They wondered why he didn't know about his own father's trust, and they started to realize that the unstable daughter he'd been whispering about was actually the one holding the legal proof of his favoritism. My mother, Diane, who had spent decades as the queen of the Bible study group and the harvest potluck, quietly pulled back from everything. She stopped showing up to Sunday brunch at the Millstone Cafe because she couldn't handle the neighbors asking, with that polite Southern fried curiosity, how Paige was doing and why she hadn't seen her at the lake house. The narrative she'd built about her abandoned life had developed cracks that no amount of church lady charm could fill. The extended family started to come back to me in small, quiet pieces. Aunt Linda, who had sat silently during that terrible Christmas dinner while my character was executed over pecan pie, was the first to call. She didn't offer a fancy excuse. She just told me she should have spoken up that night and that she'd been carrying the weight of her silence ever since. I thanked her, not because it erased the last 2 years, but because it felt like a small part of my history was being returned to me. My cousin Marcus sent a text saying he always felt something was off but didn't know how to name it. I realized then that not everyone who stays silent is an enemy. Some people are just waiting for someone else to be brave enough to tell the truth first. Daniel and I spent the month of May fixing up the lake house, and it wasn't a renovation so much as it was a long overdue conversation with the building. Daniel handled the electrical work, replacing the ancient breaker panel and installing a porch light that actually turned on when you flipped the switch. His face covered in attic dust and a grin that told me he was exactly where he wanted to be. I found Grandpa Howard's woodworking tools in the garage, each one oiled and hanging in its place like he'd just stepped away for a glass of lemonade. Beneath his workbench, I found an old photo of me at 6 years old, holding a fish that was almost as big as my arm, with Grandpa laughing behind me. He hadn't just left me a house. He'd left me proof that someone in my family saw me clearly, not as a strong girl who could be ignored, but as a granddaughter worth protecting. I sat at the kitchen table in the lake house one afternoon and wrote a letter to my parents by hand. I told them that the house would stay in the trust, exactly as Grandpa Howard intended, and that I wouldn't be signing anything away. I told them that if they wanted to rebuild a relationship with me, it wouldn't start with paperwork or money. It would start with them seeing me as their daughter instead of a utility. I told them my door was open, but only if they walked through it with honest voices and clean hands. I didn't wait for a reply, and I didn't check the mailbox every morning hoping for one. I'd said what I needed to say, and for the first time in my life, the strong one wasn't carrying anyone else's luggage. I'm sitting on the dock now in that green Adirondack chair, the one I painted when I was 10 years old. The wood is warm from the Tennessee sun, and the lake is as flat and patient as a mirror. I have Grandpa's old fishing rod in my hands, the one with the cork grip he wrapped himself. I haven't caught a thing all afternoon, and honestly, I don't care. I talk to him sometimes in my head, thanking him for the envelope and the trust and the reminder that I mattered. My hands are a little rougher than they used to be, but they're the hands of a woman who built her own life, one board at a time. My name is Paige Afton, And 2 years ago, a legal document was supposed to take something from me. Instead, it gave me back my voice. If you've made it all the way to the end of my story, I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. It truly means the world to me that you listened. This wasn't really a story about revenge. It was a story about knowing you deserve to be seen, even when the people closest to you refuse to look. So, I have one question for you today. If you could write one letter to someone who underestimated you or treated you like you didn't matter, what would you say to them? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love our little community here. And if you want to hear more stories about finding your strength, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.